and collect their illegal cut.
As you can imagine, some of the players that would have been involved, their first dime into the telephone may not have been to call law enforcement.
Italian organized crime has been around in the U.S. for decades and decades. It's very structured, it's very hierarchical, and they have a lot of rules. So if you're in the Italian mafia and someone has wronged you in some way and you want to give them a beating, you have to get permission for that. If you wanted to kill somebody, you have to get permission from the very top. That wasn't the case with these Albanians. They had spun off from the Italians, but didn't really put in place the same rules. I don't think anyone really knew exactly what they were going to do.
The bad blood between the old world and the new spilled over into the streets.
Shortly after Alex and Lenny had broken off from the Gambinos, they got into a beef with a Bonanno soldier.
The Bonanno crime family is one of the traditional five families. For decades, the Bonanno family has dominated Brooklyn.
Guy Paduto, he was a car thief associate of the Bonanno crime family.
There was a stolen car ring they were all involved in. The relationship soured. There was a shooting at this Cafe Italia.
It's alleged that they're driving after this guy and coming through the sunroof and in broad daylight, shooting at them.
The Bonanno soldier was shot multiple times and said that Alex and Lenny were the ones who had shot him.
Paduto survived.
I think they were fairly calculating. I mean, there's certainly no benefit to them in going out to kill somebody who they still want something from. There's also no sense in drawing the kind of scrutiny that comes with a dead body.
It was clear they were aware of the ramifications of taking on the mob, and they were ready for the first retaliation.
It's in the beginning of the takeover of Astoria, Queens by Alex Rudai. A Gambino soldier at the time, by the name of Tommy Napoli, opened a gambling club that didn't go over very well with the Albanians.
It was an underground gambling club known in the neighborhood as Soccer Fever.
There was a dice game known as Barboot.
It's a Greek dice game, and it can earn tens of thousands of dollars a night.
Barboot is, think of a craps table. Now, anybody that knows craps, you shoot dice, and 7, you're out, but it's you against the house, right? You put your money down, guy shoots a 7, the house takes all your money. Barboot is a game where you could have literally 50 people crowded around this dice table, and they're all playing against each other. The house takes a nice rake, as we call it. So, a very lucrative game.
Rudai's people jumped on it right away.
On the second night of operation, armed members of the Rudai organization, including Alex Rudai himself, went into Soccer Fever.
They pushed their way in past the guards, who were also armed, and they shut down the club.
They were told, your game is down, our game is up.
Alex Rudai famously announced that everyone there had to leave or he would eat them up one by one. They inflicted a very serious beating on someone to send the message that they were taking over.
And the club shut down. So from that point on, the Albanians really were ascendant in running the ethnic gambling operations in Queens.
From that moment on, the corporation began to rake. Rudai and his men were prepared for a turf war that never came.
The Italians just didn't have the ability to retaliate violently against the Albanians at this time. I suppose they could have, but it would create a lot of noise, and bodies dropping in the streets of New York City would be something that the federal authorities would notice. So it could have been a tactical decision.
I think the Lucchese's and the Gambinos didn't really know what to make of them. And because of the unpredictability of the Albanians, they didn't have rules. They weren't in a position to just organize a sit-down if something went wrong.
Have you ever seen these gentlemen? I could comfortably live in one of their arms. They're 6'3", 6'4", 6'5". There was this perception on the street that these individuals were that dangerous, that they were taking over. And I think that that just fed on itself.
By 2002, Alex Rudai had reinvented himself from a poor Albanian immigrant to a self-made mob boss. By then, the made man who Rudai seemed to model himself after was all but done.
Once Gotti was arrested in December of 1990, he just wasn't able to run things. And the people who did try to run things in his stead really weren't up to the mustard.
The Teflon Don had his own fight behind bars. In 1998, he had been diagnosed with throat cancer. After treatment, the disease had come back in 2000. The last thing on his mind may have been the Albanians.
The Gambinos didn't really know how far the Albanians would ultimately extend their territory and their control.
Ultimately, there was a meeting that was called by members of the Gambino crime family, including the acting boss of the Gambino crime family at the time, asked to have this meeting in New Jersey at a gas station.
That wasn't a good place to meet.
The acting boss, Arnold Squitieri, I think thought they were going to have some sort of rational conversation, but the Albanians got out and just started pointing their guns around and yelling and screaming.
They were ready to blow the place up.
Allegedly, Nick Dadai pointed his shotgun at the gas pump and said, "If anybody moves, I'm going to blow us all sky high."
Nick, by all accounts, was the muscle.
Nicky Dadai was enormous. He was, 6'5" or something.
They called him Nicky Nails because he would pound you into the ground.
Alex really relied on Nicky for that kind of extreme level of violence. So the Gambinos got in their cars and raced off.
Maybe they did meet at a gas station, but what does it show? It shows bravado. It shows these guys are not easily intimidated.
We had an undercover FBI agent having daily sit-downs with captains and high-level members of the Gambino family, and according to our undercover agent, it really bothered members of the high levels of the Gambino family.
The key to breaking the Rudai syndicate from a law enforcement point of view was to get information from the inside.
The case develops on the FBI side with the Italian mafia families. Obviously, the FBI knows who they are, what they're doing, who the players are. The FBI has a really good read on who's who in that world.
We had a squad for each of the 5 families, and in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we began the Albanian crime unit.
But the FBI weren't the only ones following Alex Rudai and the corporation.
We started investigating this loan sharking operation in Westchester County. We started doing surveillances, and ultimately it brought us to Alex Rudai.
Westchester County investigators from the district attorney's office started watching the corporation hotspot, then known as Cafe Roma.
We started to see cars that were, clearly, in our estimation, other vehicles occupied by law enforcement officers.
We see similar type activity, clearly law enforcement vehicles, and we go back and we do our checks, and it turns out that it's the Westchester County District Attorney's Office. And we also notice the New York State Police.
Just as members of traditional organized crime might have a sit-down to settle some issue or some dispute, we had a sit-down within law enforcement to decide, how we would go forward.
It was a sit-down. It was a sit-down in his office.
The decision ultimately was made that we would join forces and do the investigation together.
Interestingly, at the very, very beginning, Italian mafia was very hard to crack, right? They took their oath, their omerta, they didn't tell on each other. The Albanians, at least at the very beginning, were similarly hard to crack as the Italians were back in the day. None of the Albanians that we arrested in this case flipped, so we used other witnesses.
Authorities began to crack the corporation by sending them new clients. Greek gamblers were the main point of entry, or Operation Trojan Horse.
The case didn't have that name until after maybe a year and a half into the investigation. And the reason why we had it is because we were able to develop some Greek informants who were able to get close to Alex Rudai.
There was a Greek gambler named Mike. The FBI would give him money to gamble, and he would go in and he would gamble and he would wear his device and he would talk to these guys. And then we had a cooperating witness named Nick, who was also Greek. He was a businessman with a federal felony conviction, and the FBI just kind of plucked him and put him in there. Alex talked to him for hours on end about what they had done. Those recordings really were what broke everything open.
He opened the first night. I said, second night, let's go. So we walking inside, it's me, Louis, and Lenny.
On one of the recordings, Rudai is heard describing how his corporation shut down the Gambinos Soccer Fever Gambling Club after just one night in business.
So we walking inside, I say, you, don't you move. They stayed like a statue. I swear to God, I say, I'll beat you one by one. I'll eat you up.
We were sitting in our Trojan horse, who would, once inside the organization, they began to dismantle it.
The U.S. government began building a RICO case against the corporation based on the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act.
The RICO Act is basically the racketeering statute, and what it does is it criminalizes when people get together in an organized way to commit a series of crimes. It was created largely because organized crime was using legitimate businesses to conduct their activities. And then over time, the organizations that were charged tended to be more often illegal organizations like a mafia family, for example.
RICO put away the Teflon Don, John Gotti Sr., basically for life.
Gotti died in 2002 in federal prison of the effects of cancer.
As the five families mourned the loss of their recognized boss, the sixth family made a move for a seat at the table.
After John Gotti had died, Alex and his crew gathered about 20 to 30 guys. They went up to Rayo's.
Rudai and his ilk, trying to be a sixth family, trying to be like the preeminent gangsters, demanded Gotti's table.
At the end of a heated confrontation, Rayo's restaurant had a new regular.
They got the table after this show of force.
Although I don't think Rudai got to exploit it very long.
The investigation reached a logical conclusion. There were still some things we wanted to do to perhaps take it further, but in order to do that, we would need a high-level cooperating witness.
The FBI approached Louis Nukulovic, one of Rudai's trusted countrymen.
He said, I see your cars moving in and out, and I see you following me. What are you going to do to me if I say no? And then he told me that he had been arrested by the Serbs in Kosovo, that he was put in jail for 4.5 months and beaten every day before he had escaped. He actually said to me, what are you going to do to me? The Serbs beat me every day. In America, I will get free housing, I'll get 3 meals a day, and because I'm in America, you'll give me a free lawyer. When Lukanovic refused to cooperate, we scheduled the arrest for 3 weeks later.
On October 26, 2004, the U.S. government indicted Alex Rudai and members of his corporation. The charges ranged from racketeering to attempted murder, extortion, loan sharking, and gambling.
We had 26 defendants on the indictment. We had 15 search warrants, so it was an enormous operation.
We had 400 federal and state law enforcement officers dispersed executing arrests and search warrants.
At the time, Alex Rudai was actually living in Westchester County. Warrants were executed at Alex Rudai's house.
There was no violence at all that day. Everyone who was arrested came quietly, without incident.
The U.S. Attorney's Office called it the first federal racketeering case in the United States against an alleged organized crime enterprise run by Albanians. It turns out the Albanians were not that different from the mob, after all.
Rudai and all of his cohorts plead not guilty, and then what happens over the next few months, a lot of the lower-level defendants start to plead out. And ultimately, what we're left with is just the big fish.
In the fall of 2004, the federal authorities busted up a crime syndicate terrorizing greater New York. But the head of the so-called corporation was no mafia don. He was an Albanian with a wife and 3 children in the suburbs.
Rudai's corporation made over $100,000 a week. The case was about territory, and it was about money.
Alex Rudai was willing to do what needed to be done, and they did that on a number of occasions, but there weren't a stream of bodies following him either.
The downfall began with his big mouth. The Federal Bureau of Investigation infiltrated Rudai's corporation by sending in a couple of Greek gamblers wearing wires. The recordings were shocking.
They were tough guys. I mean, they had no problem going in with guns and doing what needed to be done. There was a great recording that was played at trial where someone says to him, what would have happened if the guards, started firing at you guys? And he says, everyone would have been dead.
By October 2004, the federal government had heard enough. Rudai and his men were rounded up under a sweeping indictment.
This case involved hundreds of hours of tape-recorded conversations, a multitude of charges that ranged from everywhere from attempted murder to bank fraud.
Alex was a talker. So Alex liked to brag about what they had done. We had dozens and dozens of hours of recordings of Alex Rudai talking about himself and his compatriots and what they had done. Short of having a recording of the actual crime, having a recording of someone talking about the crime is the next best thing.
He's in the knees, and he still is trying to get up. So I give him a couple more shots.
On one of the tapes, Rudai talks of terrorizing a bar owner.
The proprietor, he's told essentially that they're taking over his business, and ultimately they do, in fact, take the keys.
Rudai's talking on tape to the guy about how he's got to pay or else. So, those recordings were just dynamite for the jury to hear.
When an owner of a local establishment is taken to Mama Maria's restaurant and beaten in a basement badly, that's just not something that is okay.
The strategy in this case was to separate the violence from the gambling. That was always the plan. We opened on the gambling and said, don't worry about that. That happened. These guys were operating the illegal machines. Extract the violence from this case, and your sentences and your exposure went down dramatically.
The problem for the defense, their client was caught on tape boasting about violent acts.
Hey, remember that guy you want to hit that day? He comes to the buckle. I said, pull this out. They go away. I said, pull him next door.
One of the things Alex Rudai talked about at length was the beating of a guy named Tony in Astoria, and they were trying to serve notice that they were taking over the gambling operations. There were between 4 and 6 of them there. Alex was one of them, and they beat this guy Tony, pretty severely. He had to go to the hospital.
His phone fall down, and so I'm reaching, I see a phone, I grab him. He was in his knees. I pull the thing. I go like this. Boom. His face starts like that. Boom.
One of the recordings that we played at trial, he's talking about hitting Tony in the head with the cell phone. And then he says, and there was blood everywhere. And he says, and I was wearing these nice white pants.
And I had nice white pants. Not white pants, but like off-white.
He says, well, they were off-white. He's talking about this really serious beating that he's administering, and he's more interested in his pants.
Rudai's defense attorney, Jim Koussouras, put up a valiant fight for his guy. But, you can only go so far when you got the FBI's array of tapes, witnesses, and surveillance to go against you.
The trial lasted 14 weeks. In the end, Rudai and his top lieutenants were found guilty of all the counts against them. But the jury ruled that the government failed to prove the charge of attempted murder.
Alex was found guilty of all of the counts against him. The attempted murder was found not proven.
That took potential life sentence off the table.
Like a string of mafia dons before him, Rudai got hard time. 240 months.
If you do the math, that's 20 years. He's 48 years old right now. When he gets out, He may have some life left with his family, but that's a long time.
The wife is in the gallery, and at the sentencing, they're talking about their children and the remorse that they feel about putting their families in these situations. It's sad for them that he's done this to them.
It's always the family in the end that bears the brunt of the absence.
With Rudai and his corporation out of business, the notion of a sixth family remains a pipe dream.
It was a great case. We really felt that we had kind of cleaned up Astoria and areas of the Bronx and Westchester, and that there were people who wouldn't be terrorized by those folks anymore. So it feels good.
I have to say that the government has put the brakes on a lot of it. They've done their job, and they've done it well. I think that they've eradicated a big chunk of organized crime, at least in New York. But there's always going to be somebody. There's always going to be somebody coming up to try to fill the void.
While Rudai is reportedly stoic behind bars, life has changed for his family back in the old country.
The family suddenly became wealthy, and the story is, right, that they sold a lot of land because they were farmers, so they sold a lot of land to the Russians. That's the story in Montenegro, and they made a lot of money.
Apparently, Rudai sent some of his blood money back home, not just to his family, but to his faith.
He built the second biggest church in Montenegro. His family is also known for that. I don't think he's very religious himself, but this was something he wanted to do for his city. I guess it's a common story for quite a lot of these offenders that they find their illegitimate ways to achieve the American dream because they feel it's their duty to make money for their family back home.
I think Alex Rudai's legacy is that he started an organized crime group that was able to compete toe-to-toe with the Italian mafia families, which is an impressive feat if you're impressed by that sort of thing. But, you know, it landed him in prison for 27 years.